2 years ago, my brother, the Canadian computer collector, had a wonderful idea. An awful idea. Dan had a wonderful, awful idea. He wanted to recapture the spirit of mid-2000s LAN parties by building a Windows XP gaming computer for himself and each of his friends, then hosting a LAN party on a local network with no internet access. On the surface, this sounded pretty cool, but we had no idea just how much work it was going to be. Acquiring parts wasn't too difficult. 20-year-old computers are about as depreciated as they're going to get, but not quite retro cool enough to be appreciating in value. Kind of like how I feel as a millennial. We hadn't booked a date for the LAN yet, so we had all the time in the world to build these machines. What could possibly go wrong? In short,
everything.
My brother and I have been humbled by these machines over and over again.
It would be really nice if this would work.
But we learned a lot and grew as a result of these projects. This is my story. Before I even started my project, I got to witness Dan's odyssey. The theme for his build was 2004 Dream Machine, and it was with this build that we learned just how difficult Windows XP can be. He expected the build to take maybe a month or two, but it ended up taking nearly a year. He made a full in-depth video about that project, which we'll link to at the end of this video, but the long and the short of it is that old gaming hardware is unreliable, and Windows XP is a fickle beast. Getting drivers for a system that old is even harder than it was back then because you don't want to connect a computer running an operating system this old to the internet for security reasons. And to make matters worse, the sites that host these drivers are often 15 plus years old. So not only are they too old for R. Kelly, they're also full of dead links. But even with all the problems he experienced building his computer, Dan was still really excited for the XP LAN, and he wanted me to have a computer for it that I was excited about too. He was thinking I should have a really cool themed build. I always liked sleeper PCs, so I thought maybe I'd build something really high performance in an ugly case. I actually ended up coming across a fully functional Windows XP sleeper on Kijiji. A really nice dual core AMD that looked really cool on the inside and had a crummy OEM HP case on the outside. I picked it up for $25 and there was nothing to really do with it. It didn't need anything except a video card, and it turns out buying a project that somebody already completed doesn't really get my blood pumping, if you know what I mean. This wasn't going to be my XP LAN rig, so I gave it to Dan and he put it inside his Heroes of Might and Magic 3 Necropolis build. A link to that video will be in the description once it's done and published. I spent many moons trying to think of a cool theme for a Windows XP gaming rig. All red LEDs? Kinda boring.
Semi-modern and overpowered? Still kind of meh.
While I continued to spin my wheels, Dan went and built a semi-modern and kind of overpowered XP gaming machine in a Power Mac G4 case. It wasn't until the summer of 2024 that I figured out what I wanted. Whilst combing through photos of the LAN parties we went to in the 2000s, I realized that what did it for me was jank. There are two key things I love in a janky PC: vital components living outside the case, and zip ties. I had an idea that would be the perfect marriage of these two concepts. I'd buy an older all-in-one computer, find a way to add a full-size desktop graphics card, and zip tie everything it needs to the back of it. The first step was finding an all-in-one that wasn't built by Apple. These aren't exactly common anymore, since a lot of them suffered premature failures thanks to the poor thermals inherent to this form factor. I knew of a really low-end one running Windows 7 that was owned by a friend of mine and had a dying hard drive, so I figured she'd want to let it go, but she wasn't ready to give it up. I ended up putting out a wanted ad, and this HP Pavilion 21 eventually fell into my lap. It was only $25 and it was perfect for this use case, even if it was a little bit newer than I was hoping for. I had been hunting for months, and I left the wanted ad up for even longer, and this was the only one I found. When I brought it home, it was running Linux, which I found impressive. Most people don't think to install a lightweight operating system to keep their older hardware relevant. Props to the dude who sold it to me. It's an older crappy AMD quad core with 8 gigs of RAM. 32-bit Windows XP can only handle 4 gigs of RAM, so it's already overkill. and I know for a fact it's going to haul ass when it comes to running older games. But before I could give this computer a new life as a retro gaming rig, I was going to have to cut it up. I knew that Wi-Fi modules are normally PCI Express, and I already had a PCIe 1X to 16X adapter laying around, so I pulled the back off and discovered that it was actually mini PCIe. So me and my buddies went on a field trip to our local computer hardware store and discovered that they don't keep any of these adapters in stock. No big deal, I ordered one online and the project went back on the shelf for a few weeks while I waited for it to show up. Once it showed up, we cut a hole in the back using the classic hot knife method, but when we put it back on, we discovered the hole was actually too far down. No big deal. We cut another hole, and that original hole can be used for running zip ties when the time comes. Choosing a graphics card wasn't going to be hard. We have a huge collection, and I found myself drawn to the massive, for its time, AMD Radeon HD 6950. I loved just how overkill it was. And the thing is so beefy, it would look dramatic strapped to the back of this machine. Powering it was going to be tricky, but luckily I have a friend who can be summed up by the phrase, I void warranties. And he offered to donate an Xbox 360 power supply that we could graft ATX power cables onto. As it turns out, this card is so thirsty, it can't be quenched by a single Xbox 360 power supply. So we dug up another 360 power supply and grafted ATX power cables onto that one too. It was now time to mock up the machine and test it out. I figured I'd try Windows 10 at first and run some benchmarks just to see how bottlenecked we were by the single PCI Express lane or this kind of weak CPU. At first it all worked fine, but at some point someone must have tripped over the Ethernet cable while it was plugged in, because the port stopped working and I ended up having to tether to my phone to connect it to the internet. At first I thought it might be a driver problem or an issue with the Windows install, so I formatted and tried again, and I still had the same issue. This is a pretty big bummer since it doesn't have the internal Wi-Fi card anymore, so you need to connect it with a LAN cable. But whatever, jank is as jank does, and through the power of USB tethering, I managed to get 3D Mark on it. And it turns out the machine is just too old and crummy to run any modern benchmarks. So there goes that idea. Aside from the Ethernet port, this thing was actually super solid and reliable. Almost disappointingly so, given that jank was the theme for the build. Little did I know just how much was about to go wrong. It was now time to put Windows XP on it, which I decided to attempt during my New Year's live stream. At first, I couldn't get it to boot from CD.
CD's nut!
But eventually, I realized I had to disable Secure Boot and switch around the boot priorities. But the moment Windows was fully unpacked, it would crash. Every time. I thought it might be an issue with the way the hard drive was formatted, since I did pull it from a literal pile of e-waste. So I put it in an external enclosure and used another computer to clean the drive using DiskPart. I put it back in the computer, went to install XP, and it kept crashing in the exact same way. Luckily, I had a ton of different Windows install CDs.
CD's nuts!
And I tried them all, including a bunch that had drivers slipstreamed on them. But nothing worked. Luckily for me, Mr. I Void Warranties came up with an idea after I asked him exactly which drivers were slipstreamed on these disks he gave me. He explained to me that Windows XP didn't come with native support for SATA back in the day, so they'd slipstream AHCI drivers onto the disk. And this seemed like exactly what I needed, but I had already tried all of those disks and none of them worked. As it turns out, there's a lot of different versions of AHCI drivers, and I probably needed one that was newer than anything that was on one of these disks. So he suggested I go into the BIOS and switch it to native IDE mode. The XP install actually started this time, but it was failing to unpack certain files. This was either a problem with my literal garbage hard drive, or perhaps the CD's nut was scratched. I decided to abort the install and tried another disk. This time it actually worked, and I finally got Windows XP successfully installed on this computer. And that's when I encountered the next issue. I had to give up on the Radeon HD 6950 because Windows XP wouldn't accept drivers for it. It kept trying to use the drivers for the integrated AMD R4 graphics. I figured the fact that they were both AMD GPUs might be what was causing the problem, so I tried an NVIDIA GeForce 8800 GT, and it worked just fine. Not to mention, it only required one of the janky Xbox 360 power adapters. That's one less fire hazard for us to worry about. Even better, While I was trying to solve all of these driver issues, I had a friend tell me about Snappy Driver Installer, and this helped me find all of the rest of the missing drivers like audio, USB, etc., saving me hours of hunting because this computer was built for Windows 7, so trying to find native Windows XP drivers for this hardware would have been a nightmare. At this point, everything seemed to be working. I was tired and I didn't want to spend a bunch of time installing video games from CDs.
CDs, no.
So I figured I could wrap everything up and finish the project tomorrow. And this is the point where everything went wrong. This moment right here was the beginning of a 2-week journey spending every available evening and weekend working on this project. Given how robust Windows 10 had been on this exact hardware, I made the naive assumption that Windows XP wouldn't be much worse. When it had Windows 10 on it, I could use whatever GPU I wanted. I could unplug the external graphics card and it would still work. With Windows XP, as it turns out, the mere act of unplugging the GPU and plugging it back in would break the Windows install, requiring me to format and start from scratch. But before I figured that out, I made things worse for myself. Whilst putting it back together, I wanted to zip tie the GPU to the back with the cooling fan facing out so it wouldn't suffocate. But in the process of turning it around, I bent that mini PCIe adapter cable in a way that it didn't like, and it broke. I had to wait 4 days for a new cable to show up, and I was now really under the gun because I announced Jankuary at the start of this month, and I didn't have a single Janky project released yet. But when the cable showed up, that's when I discovered that the broken PCIe cable wasn't the only thing that was wrong. The Windows install had broken itself while I had the machine apart to replace the cable. I mistakenly believed that I had committed the cardinal sin of putting the machine completely together before it worked properly. I formatted and installed XP again, but this time I had Snappy Driver Installer, so I figured I would just let it install everything. And as it turns out, this is the first time that Snappy has failed me, because whatever NVIDIA driver it has didn't play well with this graphics card and it refused to output video. I spent days on this issue, and the only way I was able to solve it was by doing the classic troubleshooting method of doing exactly what you did before when it worked, in the exact order that you did it, with the exact things you did it with. The last time I had this graphics card outputting video, I had installed it using a USB drive with NVIDIA drivers I had downloaded direct from NVIDIA. So I did yet another fresh Windows install, and I went to install the NVIDIA drivers right away, and partway through the install, it crashed. So I did a system restore, went to install the drivers, and it crashed again. So I did another system restore, and I had the same problem every time. And that's when I noticed that after I finished the system restore, it had a little pop-up notification that mentions that some directories had been renamed. That's when I figured that system restore might not actually be properly restoring the system to exactly the way it was before. This was a red flag to me. So I went and checked, and there is an NVIDIA directory that shouldn't have been there if it had actually restored the system to the image of what it was before I had installed NVIDIA drivers. I deleted it, and it worked.
I was a god.
Yeah, I did it. I am a tech god. If I want hardware to work on you, it will work. Suck it. Double up.
The GPU can't drive the internal display, so I added a second monitor to it. Using the biggest zip ties I've ever seen, which also somehow managed to break in the process. But I cobbled it all together, I patted myself on the back again for being the god of jank, and started packing up for the night. It was in this moment that my hubris would prove to be my undoing. It was late. I had to work in the morning. The computer I am now lovingly referring to as GI Jank was outputting to both monitors. I wasn't going to disconnect the GPU. I should be fine, right? All I would need to do at this point is install some games, record myself playing them, and the video would be done. I'm sure you can see where this is going. When the computer is off, the video card spins its fan at full speed because it's receiving power but no signal. This is a common behavior for graphics cards to protect themselves. As a result, I cut power to everything before leaving, so I'm not leaving a fan spinning aggressively all night. When I came back the next morning, once again the install was broken. I decided to try a few recovery commands, like check disk to make sure that the garbage hard drive was good, and luckily it was, but in the end, I knew what I had to do. I formatted. I installed Windows XP. I had a hunch that the PCIe adapter was causing trouble, and while reviewing old footage, I noticed Snappy Driver Install had drivers for it. So I installed those drivers first, then I installed the NVIDIA driver myself, and it worked. I wasn't taking any chances this time. I was getting output to both displays, so I installed a bunch of games and everything just worked.
The smoking ruins of Cloudfire greeted us with nothing but destruction and the stench of death.
Ooh, high resolution. Oh my.
What the heck is happening over here? Everything just worked. Except for Warcraft 3, which nearly gave me a heart attack because it crashed the whole system when I tried to launch it after installing, and I had very little confidence that I would actually be able to boot back into Windows again. Luckily, that didn't break the install. In the end, even though it fought me the whole way, I managed to force this computer to be a Windows XP gaming machine. But I also understand that it really doesn't want to, so it's time for a postmortem. As I said at the start of Jankuary, if you don't do a postmortem, you're choosing not to level up. And oh boy, did I get enough experience from this project to level up multiple times. Lesson number 1, Windows XP is very sensitive to hardware changes and doesn't play well on hardware that wasn't built for it. Even though I managed to force this computer to be a Windows XP gaming rig, it's not going to be reliable as long as Windows XP is on it. There's something about that mini PCIe to PCIe adapter that just doesn't play well with Windows XP. I could switch it back to Windows 7 to see if it's more reliable, or I could probably just remove the GPU since the R4 graphics that are integrated are probably good enough for Windows XP. Lesson number 2, drivers can make or break a machine, and I am grateful that I learned about Snappy Driver Installer thanks to this project. It will save me a ton of time in the future, but I also know that sometimes I still need to go find the driver myself. If I'm seeing issues that feel like driver problems, I can't just assume that Snappy got it right. And finally, Jank is fun, but you don't want to rely on it. I wouldn't be confident taking this computer to a LAN party. I'm almost certain that I would have to reinstall everything as soon as I got there, especially since I'm confident that this Windows install is going to break as soon as I pull it apart to take it off the workbench. I actually have a friend who was famous locally for having to reinstall Windows every time he showed up at the LAN party, and through this project, I gained some insight into why that might have happened. So what do you think I should do with this machine next? I was thinking about SteamOS, but this hardware is a little too crusty for modern games. I'm pretty sure Windows 7 would still be fine for XP era games. Or maybe I just pull the GPU off and see if the integrated graphics are good enough to run games from the early 2000s at decent settings. Let me know in the comments. I would love to hear what you'd do with this machine. And if you want to see Dan go through something similar, why don't you watch this video where he built his dream XP era gaming machine.
These nuts, CD's nuts, CD's nuts, CD's nuts, CD's nuts.